Hello, everyone. You see, I have my pocket watch out, and this lecture will be 45 minutes, I assure you. Let's hope. Anyway, hi, everyone. It's me, Mr. Macaluso, and today we're going to talk about Woodrow Wilson and his attempt to engineer the Treaty of Versailles in a way that will be beneficial to, he thinks, the world. Okay? I call this the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson. Now remember, back in ninth grade you studied tragedy, right? You didn't actually read Oedipus Rex, but you read parts of it. And you should know that a tragedy, in the Greek sense of the word, is when a hero, that is someone who seems greater than everyone else, has a fatal flaw, and that fatal flaw leads to his or her downfall. Okay? So Woodrow Wilson is the hero of our tragedy today. All right? And as I said the other day, my last lecture, Woodrow Wilson has this crazy idea that America could cease being a city upon a hill and instead go all the way back to Europe and make the world more like us. So instead of America just being an example to the world, in this case a good example, America would be an agent in the world and would make the world more like the United States, make the world more democratic. And, he has this view that America is this place of, liberty and justice. And it is for some, but not for all. And we're going to see many of his ideas are progressive. And then many of them just kind of show a certain kind of hypocrisy. All right. As I've tried to make the point in the past, Wilson is not going to get his way yet. But after World War II, a lot of what Woodrow Wilson thinks should happen in the world will happen. And honestly, it's created a lot of stability in the world until about this present moment. And these days we're kind of rethinking. That might be a strong word, but it's not clear to me anyway whether we will continue on in this kind of Wilsonian world. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get on to the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so first off, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The U.S. declares war on the Central Powers on April 6th, 1917. Germany was hoping that that would not happen. As I think Ariane asked me in our class today, he said, why did Germany start unrestricted submarine warfare? Didn't he know that, or didn't Germany know that it would get the U.S. riled up? And my answer was, yeah, it was gambling. It was hoping that the U.S. would not get riled up fast enough and that Germany could win the war before the U.S. actually entered the war. And that didn't work out. Okay, so the U.S. declares war April 6, 1917, and it's mainly because Germany is, sinking merchant ships. Also, the Zimmermann telegraph. I don't remember if I talked about that in my last lecture. I should have. If I didn't, I'll explain it later. And Wilson says that the U.S. is entering this war to make the world safe for democracy. Okay, so that's the rhetoric, that this is not a war of conquest. The U.S. is not going to conquer Europe and make it a vassal state. It is going to make Europe in our own image. Okay. Now, recently, Russia has had a revolution. The Tsar was overthrown. Later on, there's another revolution, and the communists take over. But in that, actually, it's the second revolution when the communists take over. Russia makes peace with Germany. Now, imagine that. Remember, Germany never wanted to fight a war on two fronts, and it knew that fighting Russia was mainly difficult because Russia was so big. Now Germany can take a huge part of its army, probably more than half of its army, take it away from the Russian front and bring it over to the Western front, where it can then, hopefully create a breakthrough in the Allied lines and force an end to the war. Okay? But America is going to get there just in time to blunt this offensive, as I said, I think in my last lecture. And not only has America helped to stop that offensive, it's not true that America does it single-handedly. Americans just kind of fill the lines. But America helps to blunt the offensive. Plus, Woodrow Wilson is offering what he calls his 14 points. Now, these 14 points are the basis on which he wants to create a peace treaty. We will talk of 7 of them, only half. If you want all 14, you'll have to pay extra. Not really. These are the 7 that I think are most easily digestible. All right. So, number 1, Woodrow Wilson thinks that the world needs to abolish secret treaties. If you were a good doobie and you watched that Khan Academy series of lectures on the beginning of World War I, you would know that the thing that helped start this massive war was that all these countries had treaties with each other that were not publicly known. So in other words, when Austria declares war on Serbia, it doesn't really know the details of the treaty between Russia and Serbia. And when Russia declares war on Austria, it doesn't realize that Germany and Austria have a treaty. And when Germany declares war on France and goes through Belgium, it doesn't really realize that Britain will aid Belgium. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson says we got to get rid of these secret treaties so that we all know who's friends with whom. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? I don't think I need to explain that any more deeply. The next thing, and this is a very American idea. He says there should be freedom of the seas. Now, we talked about this in this morning's class. How long has the United States been saying there should be freedom of the seas? From the get-go, right? Jay's Treaty was about this. Not really Pinckney's Treaty, but kind of Pinckney's Treaty. The Quasi-War was about this. The War of 1812 was about this. The U.S. has, from the beginning anyway, saw itself as a trading nation, a merchant nation, and it thought, wrongly, that it would always be neutral because countries would depend on the U.S. for goods so badly that countries would always respect our neutrality. Well, that turned out never really to be the case. Okay, Britain would attack our ships, France would attack our ships. Here we go again. Now it's Great Britain and it's Germany. Okay, now, oddly, Woodrow Wilson never makes a big deal about Great Britain sinking American merchant ships with naval mines. But he does make a really big deal about Germany doing that with torpedoes. So he wants freedom of the seas. This is related. He wants free trade. He thinks there should be no tariffs. Here's the idea. Write this down. This is important. The idea is this. If we trade with other countries, those countries won't go to war with us. So the more countries trade with each other, the less wars there'll be. That makes sense, doesn't it? It's clear to me that the U.S. and China are at odds often these days. Okay, now, obviously, we live in strange times, right? Interesting times, as the Chinese might say. But the fact is, China owns so many U.S. Treasury bonds. They've loaned us so much money that China doesn't want to go to war with the United States because it wouldn't get its money back. And the U.S. traditionally has not wanted to go to war with China. A, it's too big of a country to go to war with. But B, where would we buy our flat screen TVs from? Right? That we rely on cheap, I should say inexpensive Chinese goods so much that even though our governments don't always see eye to eye, that there is this need for us to have a friendly relationship. Okay, so that's Woodrow Wilson's idea. If there's free trade, if we get rid of tariffs, countries trade with each other more frequently, and therefore they don't go to war with each other. Let me give you another example. After World War II, and this is an example of Wilson's ideas coming to fruition finally, after World War II, Germany and France make an agreement that they will basically integrate their steelmaking industries. Here's why. After the Franco-Prussian War, Germany takes part of France. And that part of France was really economically viable to France. After World War I, France is going to take part of Germany. What part of Germany? Well, the coal and iron ore producing part of Germany. And Adolf Hitler is later going to use that as a great reason why Germany should go to war with France, to get that coal and iron ore and steel producing region back. And he does go to war, and it's very destructive. So after World War II, basically with U.S. leadership, Europe is kind of forced into a situation where they're going to integrate their industry. So Germany and France will not go to war with each other again. Okay? And that has been the case ever since. Let's hope it stays that way. I mean, now Europe is very integrated, right, with the European Union. We're seeing it fray a little bit with Brexit. And that's what I mean when I say that maybe this Wilsonian world is starting to slip away from us. But I want you to understand these things that Wilson wanted to set up, because after World War II, these things did give us quite a bit of stability, right? On the other hand, President Trump would say, well, free trade has ruined American workers because now all of our manufacturing takes place in foreign countries, and that's hurt American workers. That's absolutely the case. That is true. But, does that mean we should raise tariffs again? I don't know. But it seems like a risky thing. Anyway, next one, arms reduction. This one is, I don't even know if I should explain it. Woodrow Wilson wants every country to sign treaties that would limit the number of weapons it could have, the tonnage of naval ships it could have. Do you know what I mean by tonnage? You measure a ship in the amount of tons of water it displaces, right? So if every country is limited to a certain number of, or a certain amount of ship tonnage, navies will be smaller. Now think about this. If you have a big navy and you're the admiral of that navy, how do you justify the expense of such an expensive military? Well, you use it. So the idea is, if you have smaller armies and navies, you don't have to justify the expense, and therefore you don't go looking for reasons to use those armies and navies. Okay? So you would limit the number of ships, you would limit the size of the army. Okay, maybe later on you'll even limit what kind of weapons you could have. Okay, that reminds me. Does anyone know where Napoleon kept his armies? Well, you can ask me later. I'm not going to tell you. Okay, next, adjustment of colonial claims. I would have to say that this is pretty progressive on Wilson's part. Okay, so again, if you were watching those Khan Academy videos, there was one that talked about how Africa had been divided up like I would say like a pie, but Africa bears no resemblance to a pie whatsoever. How about this? A tray of brownies, just carved up into different colonies. Okay? That's why when you look at a map of Africa, it looks like the American West, where countries don't have geographic boundaries that are marked by rivers or mountain ranges. They're just straight lines. There are no rivers that are straight lines, right? So when you see a map like that, you have to say, oh, this is an artificial map. Well, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, our boy, was it Otto von Bismarck or was it Metternich? I don't know. You AP European folks should know. One of those two, either Austrian or Prussian statesmen, basically said, well, it was Berlin, so it must have been Bismarck. Bismarck called all of the European nations together and said, hey, instead of fighting over Africa, let's just divide it up and divvy up the spoils. Okay? Now, that's a terrible thing. Wilson's not saying get rid of the colonies. Although, after World War II, we're going to see that colonies start fighting for their independence. And that's largely a byproduct of World War I and World War II. But anyway, what Wilson's saying is this. When they created those colonies, the Europeans paid no attention whatsoever to the different, the different tribal elements in Africa. So if you're part of the Yoruba tribe, you might get divided between a French colony and a British colony, right? And the Europeans don't care at all that half of your family lives on the other side of the boundary. They don't care because they just see Africa as a place for them to take resources from. They don't care about, the tribal or family or ethnic or language connections between people. So Woodrow Wilson, he wants to remedy that. Again, he's not getting rid of colonialism. He just wants the colonists to adjust their boundaries so that different ethnicities or tribal identities or language identities can live in the same colony. Okay, that might be a little hard to understand for some of you, so you might jot down a note to ask me about that next class. Okay, so adjustment of colonial claims. Again, a step in the right direction, but a small step. Number 6. This is similar to 5. Self-determination for European minorities. Okay, now, what do I mean by minorities here? I don't mean racial minorities. Okay, I mean if you look at Europe today, there's a lot of immigration coming from northern Africa or the Arab world, and so. But I don't mean minorities like that. What I mean is this. Take, for instance, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mentioned to a certain degree, and the Khan Academy lectures did a really good job of explaining this. There are different ethnic identities living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Woodrow Wilson wants them to have self-determination. So what do you get? After the war, instead of having the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you get the nation of Austria, which is German. You get the nation of Hungary, which is Hungarian. And then you get Czechoslovakia, right, which is Slavic. Later on, Czechoslovakia in 1993 on New Year's Day, Czechoslovakia will divide into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Okay, so Wilson went so far; he didn't go all the way. After World War I, you get Yugoslavia, which means the Southern Slavs. But today we don't have Yugoslavia. We have Croatia and Bosnia and Slovenia and Macedonia and all these different countries. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, remember, he's from Virginia, right? Virginia fought for its own self-determination during the Civil War. And Woodrow Wilson is kind of, he was brought up in Virginia, and he sees it as important for people to be self-determined. So he wants there not to be big empires in Europe, but there to be smaller countries made up of homogeneous ethnic identities. Okay? And today, that's more and more the case, although there are still some ethnic identities in Europe longing to be free, right? The Catalonians, for instance, would like their independence from Spain. At least some of them would. Okay, so self-determination for European minorities. Somewhat similar to adjustment of colonial claims, obviously going further in Europe than in Africa. All right, and then the last of the 7 that I'll talk about is this. And for Woodrow Wilson, this is the biggest one. He wants to establish what he calls the League of Nations. Okay, now, the League of Nations is going to be just that. It's going to be kind of this big collection of all the countries in the world who will meet in, it's not an alliance and it's not a government, but it's kind of somewhere between those things. Think of it as like the Articles of Confederation, where you have a central authority with not a lot of power. Okay? This is an idea which we call today collective security. Okay? Write this down. This is really important. Think of it this way. The United States used to be a confederacy, which meant that the federal government was weak. Okay? Now we're a federation, right? We have a strong federal government, which means the federal government is strong. Does that federal government prevent states from fighting each other? Of course it does, right? States were not fighting each other during the Articles of Confederation, but could it have happened? Of course it could have happened. Okay, so the League of Nations would be like the policeman. So if one nation was misbehaving, all of the other nations would get together and gang up on that nation and make it stop. If you think about it, isn't this the way society is supposed to work? If I go out and do something terrible, out in public, I break a law, what will happen to me? The police will arrest me. Let's hope. Okay. Now, who designates the police as the people who can enforce laws? Well, the rest of us do. So, if we didn't have that system, if I were breaking a law, some private citizen would have to come out and deal with me, right? That's no good. No one wants to do that. So we call the police. The League of Nations would be like the police, all right? And Wilson thinks that if there's any problem in the world, the League of Nations can solve it. On paper, that sounds pretty good. All right, let's move on. Those are the 14 points. Germany sees the 14 points, realizes that it can't fight the war much longer, that America is too big, that Germany will never win. And so on November 1st, 1918, at the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th month, it's not November 1st, it's November 11th. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. November 11th, 11, 11, 11, 11, 1918. There is an armistice that is signed. Okay, an armistice is basically a ceasefire. It is not a peace treaty. It's a ceasefire. Okay. Wilson is offering peace without victory, and Germany agrees to a ceasefire to negotiate the peace. Okay. Let's just look at the battle casualties here. Russia, 12 million people mobilized. 1.7 million killed in action. Can you imagine 1.7 million? No wonder they had a revolution, right? For the Russian soldiers were being sent up to the front without rifles. And they were told, well, just grab one from the guy in front of you who dies. That doesn't sound like a very morale-boosting strategy, does it? Hey, guys, we don't have enough hockey sticks. But, as soon as Peyton gets his collarbone broken, just pick up his stick and play with that. I mean, not a great... Well, actually, maybe I'll try that next year. Anyway, Russia, 4.950 million wounded. That's a lot of casualties, right? Great Britain, 900,000 dead. France, 1.35 million dead. Italy, 650,000 people dead. The United States, 116,000. Okay, that's a lot, but much smaller than the rest. Japan, 300. Got out easy. Okay, I'm not going to read all these numbers. You can read them yourself. Look at Germany, 1.77 million people dead. Okay, that's hard. Okay, and Germany says, we're out. Okay, we want peace. Okay, now, here's where the tragedy starts. Okay, so I'm going to give you a list of things that Wilson does to screw things up. Okay, so look at the picture here. There's Woodrow Wilson addressing a joint session of Congress. Okay, remember, he's the first president to start doing this for the State of the Union. Before this, presidents did not go to Congress to do this, but Wilson does. It's kind of his extension of the bully pulpit. Okay, here's the deal. During the war, the Democrats and the Republicans, they decide to have a truce. That is, they're going to stop fighting about everything while American soldiers are off fighting in Europe. They're going to get along. Wouldn't that be nice? We'd like that, wouldn't we? So there's a bipartisan truce, but Wilson is going to break it. So when was the armistice? It was in 1918. What else is going to happen in 1918? Answer this question out loud right now. There's going to be an election. What kind of election will it be? That's right, a midterm election. Okay, now, is Wilson running in this election? Of course not. It's a midterm. But do presidents care about midterm elections? We talked about this with old Andy Johnson. He went swinging around the circle, didn't he? Well, they do care. Think about what Wilson wants. He's got more progressive reforms. he also has a peace treaty that he wants to get passed. And is this peace treaty going to be a pretty large departure from what's happened in the past? Of course it is. Okay? He wants a big majority in Congress for these things. What do we need to ratify a treaty? Which house does the ratification? That's right, the Senate. And how many senators do you need? 2/3, right? So essentially, Woodrow Wilson pulls an Andy Johnson. He goes out stumping. Do you know what stumping means? I don't know if I ever used that term with you. Stumping is just going out and giving your political speech. You stand on a stump. He wasn't standing on a stump, but you get the idea. He stumps for Democrats in the midterm election of 1918, and he wants a large majority in Congress to get his progressive and foreign policy plans passed, but he loses. This is his 6th year into his presidency. This is sometimes commentators call this the 6-year itch. People get tired of presidents. There's a fatigue factor that gets in there, and people start saying like, "Oh, enough of this guy, Dayenu," right? Let's vote for some Republicans to slow this guy down, right? Like, remember, he campaigned on the idea of keeping America out of war, and then what did he do? He went to war. And Americans now are realizing like, oh, I'm never going to see my son again, or I'll never see my father again. I'm not very happy that we went to that war. 116,000 people was a lot. Okay, so it backfires. Wilson breaks the bipartisan truce. It backfires, and now the Republicans have no reason to back Wilson anymore, right? Because he broke the truce first. Okay, second thing that he does wrong. So write this down. Number 2, Wilson, the very first time ever a U.S. president travels to Europe while president. Okay, can you see him in the picture there? Can you make him out? I'll point him out to you if you need me to. Is it this guy? No. Is it that guy? That's the guy in that banking song we watched. Remember Mary Poppins? It's this guy. There he is. There's Woody. Now, Wilson travels to France personally to negotiate the treaty. First American president to do that. Presidents travel the world frequently these days, but things are different, right? When you get on Air Force One today, can you make it to any part of the world without landing? Yes, you can. You might have to get refueled in midair, but you can do that. Do you ever lose contact with the media or your government at home when you do that? No, you don't. Air Force One has a pretty killer radio on it. You can get Spotify on that thing, I'm sure. You can also communicate with anyone you need to. It's designed to survive a nuclear war and to command and control the U.S. Government and military from, however high airplanes fly. Okay, but back then, that's not the case. Woodrow Wilson's going to have to take a steamship to Europe. How long will that take? Probably 2 weeks. He's going to have to negotiate. How long will that take? A couple of weeks. He's going to have to come back home. How long will that take? A couple of weeks. So here's why this is a problem. There's a couple of problems. He's out of touch, right? What will his political enemies do when he's not around? They're going to cause trouble, won't they? I mean, this is why I try never to be sick from teaching, because I hate this idea that kids are going to walk into old 225 and someone's going to say, he's not here. And then everyone else is going to go, yes! Come on, man. That's not nice. So I refuse. That's why I come to school all the time, just out of spite. So Woodrow Wilson, he goes to Europe, and, people back home are like, yes! And they're going to cause trouble for him. He doesn't bring any Republican senators with him. This is foolish. Who has to ratify the treaty he negotiates? The Senate. Who controls the Senate? Republicans. Think about this. If Wilson goes to Europe by himself, does that give him a lot of attention? Yeah. Will the Republicans be a little jealous? Yeah, they won't say that, but they'll be jealous, and they'll accuse Wilson of grandstanding. Do you know what that means? It's a weird word, but it basically means like making yourself the center of attention. Now, imagine this. Imagine he says to a couple of Republicans on the Foreign Relations Committee, hey, I really need your help to help me negotiate this. Can you come with me? You've got some good ideas. If he does that, do those Republican senators then become invested in also being the people who helped end war forever? Yes, no Republican. I mean, this sounds horribly cynical, but it's true. No Republican or anyone is ever going to want the opposing party to get credit for ending war forever. Could you imagine that? What did you do in the last 4 years? Well, I ended war forever. Like that would be pretty hard to beat that guy, right? Or that party. So by not bringing any Republicans, he's basically creating enemies. And the enemies are the people he has to rely on to ratify the treaty. Here's another problem. He's going to be the only allied leader at the negotiations who don't have a legislative majority at home. Now, anyone taking comparative government next year will understand this better. But all of these other leaders, Georges Clemenceau, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Victoriano Orlando of Italy, they're all prime ministers, which means, by definition, they have a legislative majority in their parliament that elected them prime minister. Is that legislative majority going to back them? One would think. Are Republicans going to back this Democratic president? No. So that's going to be a problem. When Wilson gets to France, the people turn out in masses and they treat him as a hero. Okay? That would be fun, wouldn't it? Can you imagine taking a steamer to Europe and getting off in some French port and just like all of France seemingly like cheering you? Wouldn't that be awesome? That would be great. Would it go to your head? It would go to, it's already going to my head. I'm already imagining it. It goes to his head. What do you think these other guys are thinking? Do you think they're like, oh, awesome, I get to be around a hero? Or do you think they're thinking, American, we're going to have to put this guy in his place? I'll let you be the judge. Okay, so here's what happens. This is number 3. Wilson wants peace without victory, and he wants the League of Nations. The Europeans want the spoils. Now, do you remember this, the spoils system? The spoils are like they won the war. The war was terrible. They want to go home to their people and say, here's why all that death was worth it. Right? What did I say? 800,000 people in Great Britain are dead. 1.3 million Frenchmen are dead. If you're the leader of France, you don't want to come home and be like, oh, yeah, no, there were no victors. No one won. It's a tie. It was a tie. No big deal. All these people died, and we didn't get anything out of it. So European allies say, like, okay, Wilson, if you want the League of Nations, we'll allow that, but you got to give us some land. So they compromise. The Allies get German territory. They also get German colonies. They're going to get some Ottoman Empire territory as well. But they agree to the League of Nations. Okay, so France gets Alsace-Lorraine, which you can see on the map over here in yellow. And they also get the Rhineland. The Rhine River runs through here. This is going to be a demilitarized zone. Germany cannot put any troops there, ever. Because what might they do? They might invade Belgium again. So this, we say like, no, Germany, never again. They're gonna remilitarize it under Hitler. And France is gonna say like, stop, or I'll say stop again. Okay, they get these things called mandates. I'm not gonna go into exactly what those are, but basically the League of Nations is going to say to France, you are going to govern the part of the Ottoman Empire that is called Syria today. They also get Lebanon, right? Think about this. Remember old Miss Haddad, your lower school French teacher? Where was she from? She was from Lebanon. Did you ever wonder, why do they speak French in Lebanon? Here's why. Great Britain gets Iraq. Yes, Iraq will be carved from the Ottoman Empire. It's one of the reasons why Iraq is such a mess. Iraq doesn't make any sense. You've got a Sunni minority that used to govern a Shiite majority, and then you also have Kurds living there. And the three of those groups, they don't get along very well, do they? Okay, so That's why World War I has such a big effect on the world, because of the way things are carved up. Wilson agrees, thinking, you know what, this is bad. This goes against my principles. But in the end, how will we be able to fix this? I understand that France wants Alsace-Lorraine back, or wants it. But if it's unjust, the League of Nations will eventually fix it, right? So he's willing to put up with an imperfect treaty, knowing or thinking that it can always be improved upon over time. Not a bad idea, it's just not going to work very well. Okay, next. This is number 4. So Wilson's there negotiating. And I wish we had more time to talk about the Treaty of Versailles, because there's just like a lot going on there, but we just don't have the time. But he has to return home to put out some political fires. Who's starting those fires? Republicans, of course. Okay, there's a bunch of Republicans who are called the irreconcilables. That is, they cannot be reconciled to this treaty. And they are saying, we are not going to ratify the Treaty of Versailles with the League of Nations in it. They are refusing. Okay, so Wilson has to go home to get their support. The thing that they're objecting to is a part of the treaty called Article 10. Okay, Article 10 of the treaty basically says this. The League of Nations will defend the territorial integrity of all of its members. That is, if, the newly created country of Czechoslovakia gets invaded by Germany, the League of Nations will band together and kick Germany out of Czechoslovakia. Okay? That's going to happen later on. Germany will invade part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and the League of Nations isn't going to do jack. But there's a reason for that. American senators are saying, we don't want any part of that. We didn't like going to war in Europe to begin with. And the League of Nations, Article 10 just makes it seem like we're going to get drawn into European wars all the time. We're isolationists. We don't want to do that. Because, we're going to be forced to enforce it because of collective security. We don't want to do it. It also means that this treaty could make the U.S. go to war instead of, it would be the treaty that would make America go to war instead of a declaration of war from Congress. And the Senate says, no way, we're not going to give up that power to a bunch of foreigners, right? Think about how this would play in American politics today. Can you imagine some Democrat has the idea like, hey, let's make it so that the United Nations can call American troops into combat whenever they want. Like, how well would that go over? That would not go over well, okay? I don't think any party would actually think that was a good idea. And it calls the Monroe Doctrine into question. The U.S. has firmly established the idea that we're in charge in the Western Hemisphere, but what does the League of Nations say? It says, no one's in charge. The League is going to oversee things. So why would we want to give up power over the Western Hemisphere to a League of Nations? Let French people tell us what to do? Come on, don't be silly. Okay, so that's what the Senate objects to. Let me go back. And think about this. Here's I want to give you this analogy because I haven't given you an analogy in so long. Okay? Imagine that I go to buy a new car. Do you think I'm good at negotiating for a new car? You're right. I'm terrible at it. Why am I so terrible at it? Well, there's a lot of reasons, frankly. But one of the reasons I'm terrible at it is because I never do it. I never buy new cars. I buy old cars, right? Why buy a new car when you can buy an old car? It's like such a better deal. It's also broken in. I love the smell. No, actually, so, I'm bad at it. And so the few times I have gone to a car dealership to buy a new car, what do you think the car salesman saw walking in the door? A giant sucker walking in, right? He was just like licking his chops like, oh, I'm going to eat this guy alive. This guy, look, you can see he's got chalk on his shoes. He must be a teacher. This guy knows nothing. I'm going to destroy him. And sure enough, that's what happened. Now, One time, I made the horrendous decision of going to negotiate for a car with my wife. That did not work out well at all. Why? Well, because my wife and I wanted different things. What do I want? I want the cheapest car possible. I don't care about anything, any amenities. I mean, if I could buy a car without a seat, I would. I'd just stand. I'm standing right now. I don't like sitting. If it saved me some money, I'd go for it. My wife, on the other hand, she's kind of fancy. Does she want a heated steering wheel? Yeah. You live in Maryland. You don't need a heated steering wheel in Maryland. That's crazy. We used to live in Wyoming. She grew up in Boston. It was cold there. We didn't have heated steering wheels back then, and we were just fine. I mean, our hands were cold, but it's made us stronger. But so they realize this, and they know that if they just mention some nice amenity, it's going to cause conflict between us, and it's going to weaken my bargaining position. Okay? Do you want the automatic infant bubble wrap swaddler? Of course we do, she says, right? That is like if you're ever in danger, your child gets wrapped in bubble wrap immediately. You don't even have to be driving. You could just be, at home, and all of a sudden the car wraps your child up in bubble wrap, and nothing ill will befall that child. I don't want that. I want my kids to get knocked down and hurt a little bit. It toughens them up. But she wants it, and she's going to get it. She's going to win that one. And so here's the analogy I'm making. Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe to negotiate, and the Europeans realize, oh, the Senate back home wants something completely different. So we can basically really, really beat this guy up. So the European allies see Wilson's weakness, and they demand more German concessions, right? They say, like, okay, if you want us to put exceptions into the League of Nations, right, Article 10, if you want to be exempted from Article 10, well, here's what we want. We want the Germans to admit war guilt in the treaty. So all this death and destruction, whose fault was it? Not ours. It was Germany's fault. Okay? Might not seem like a big deal, but if you're one of those leaders who led your country into war and 1 million people died, wouldn't you want to have a piece of paper that said, look, the Germans admitted it was their fault? That would save your behind, wouldn't it? It's called covering your tuchus. They are going to lose more territory. They are going to have to pay reparations. 33 billion US dollars. They don't denominate it in US dollars. It's 132 gold Deutschmarks that they're going to owe. And that's 1918's value. Economists, a guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes is going to look at that. He's at the treaty, and he says, like, Germany can't repay that ever. That will never get repaid. But they put it into the treaty. Now, does that seem like peace without victory? No, it doesn't seem like peace without victory at all. But if you look over on the other slide, Wilson thinks, oh, no worries. The League of Nations will take care of this. It's bad, but we'll fix it. Okay? By the way, these are the things that are going to lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Right? Hitler's going to come to power in part by saying, we were double-crossed. We were stabbed in the back. We could have kept fighting World War I and won that war, but we decided to have an armistice because we thought we'd get a fair treaty, but we didn't get a fair treaty. And of course, Hitler's going to blame it on the Jews. He's going to blame it on communists, right? He's going to say we were stabbed in the back. They didn't get the deal they wanted, but Hitler is incorrect in saying why, right? He makes those things up in order to find a scapegoat and allow him to rise to power, right? He realizes that if he blames other people, especially people that are already kind of marginalized in society or easily marginalized, that will make him more popular. Pay attention to that. We're living through troubled times, and sometimes leaders will try to do that, so pay attention. Now, Wilson comes home, and the Senate still refuses to ratify the treaty. They've got their exceptions from Article 10, but they still say, no, we don't like the League of Nations. Okay? Wilson, his next move is this. He goes on what's called a whistle-stop tour. Remember, this is the era of the bully pulpit, And Wilson's idea is if he goes over the head of the Senate directly to the American people, then he can get the American people to force the Senate to do something. What is a whistle stop? If you look at the picture, you can see that he is on the back of a railroad car. The idea is he takes a train across the country, and every time he gets to a major city or a town, he stops and gives a speech in favor of the treaty. Okay? The problem is Republican senators follow him a day or two behind and give a speech refuting his arguments. Okay? He's working so hard that he actually has a stroke while he is visiting Pueblo, Colorado. He is incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. His wife, he actually gets married in the White House. His wife tries to run the show behind the scenes. He's he's sick in bed. But think about this: to get a treaty passed, you have to twist a lot of arms. You do, and in 1919, a first lady is not going to be able to twist arms very well. Okay, so in the end, Wilson says this: let's make the election of 1920 into a solemn referendum. Now, a referendum is when the people vote on an issue, on a specific issue. Okay, so we have these today in Maryland anyway. You know, you might go to Maryland and there might be something, you're voting for who the governor is going to be, but you might also be voting as to whether the state should allow gambling. That was they're called initiatives, but, we voted on that a couple of years back, right? A referendum's the same kind of thing. Now, don't get me wrong here. When you go to vote in 1920, there's not going to be a question as to whether we should ratify the treaty or not, but Wilson says, if you vote for the Democrat, James Cox, remember Wilson's already had 2 terms and he's had a stroke, so he's not running again. But if you vote for the Democrat, you're voting for the treaty. And if you vote for the Republican, Warren G. Harding, you are voting against the treaty. Okay? Now, Warren G. Harding, his campaign slogan is this: a return to normalcy. Okay? Now, normalcy is not an actual word, but he makes it a word. It's a word now because of him. It's maybe the only thing he did as president, other than scandal. He was considered to be one of the very worst presidents ever. I think historians have reevaluated that, but he's still pretty far down on the list. And he runs on this idea that, you know what, Wilson has created all these reforms. He sent us to war in Europe. Let's just get back to normalcy. And guess who wins? I already told you, I guess. Warren G. Harding. Note, he was elected in 1920, so he will die in office. He dies of officially it's a burst appendix, although some people claim that his wife poisoned him for having an affair. I found this online, this campaign slogan or poster, America First, and when I saw it, I didn't believe it. I felt like, someone must have just kind of made this recently. I had never associated the phrase America First with Warren G. Harding. Obviously, President Trump uses that often, but I associate this phrase with Charles Lindbergh, who, prior to the U.S. entry into World War I, leads an organization called America First, trying to keep America out of the war. Why does he want to keep America out of the war? Well, he looks back at World War I and says, that was a bad idea. We should not have gone to war. Anyway, apparently I looked it up online, and as far as I could tell, this was an actual campaign poster for Warren Harding. He's a pretty handsome guy. He was considered handsome at the time. He's not my type, but some people say he's the first guy to get elected president because he looked presidential. The problem was he was kind of a dummy and was actually a terrible president. Fortunately, nothing really of major consequence happened on his watch. But there's a lot of scandals and whatnot. Anyway, that's all I have. I went a little bit over. I'm sorry, but I'm saying goodbye now. That was fast, too. I went quickly. So hopefully you have a lot of questions. Come to class. You can ask me on Monday or on Wednesday. All right. Enjoy the weekend. Bye-bye.